I think I like doing the neck because it's simple, and I typically will roast it, a bit of olive oil, salt, and maybe some rosemary. Brown it off each side for a few minutes, put in the oven, leave it. This is the sort of thing I can be cooking while I'm milking the cows.
This is The Crackling. I'm Anthony Huckstep. For over 40 years, Michael Wohlstadt has produced milk and meat in the Barossa Valley, but more recently he's made a name for himself with the way he is farming pigs. Michael's Jersey milk is used for butter and cream, but it's also used to raise free-range Berkshire and Tamworth pigs, and it's likely to be the only milk-fed pig herd in Australia. Michael, how are you?
Good morning.
It's good to get you on the show. Milk-fed pigs, that's not something you often hear about.
No, but it's something I saw as a child. And my parents came from Berlin after the war, and they moved into a rural location in the mid-north of South Australia. And there were farmers that were very welcoming of these new immigrants. And we visited there often. Then when we left, we went back to that area, and it was that typical mixed farm where they had a small herd of cows and they would separate on farm for cream. What did they do with the skim milk? They had a small herd of pigs. They had, 200 hens and collected eggs. They had sheep and wheat. It was a dryland area. And of course, farming has, in general terms, gravitated to monocultures where there's specialisation around one type of production, be it vineyard or dryland farming, or so it's something I'd seen as a child, and I think it's also where I had this enduring ambition to be a farmer, even though and I think it must have come from then, because that was, although no farming background in the family, I was determined to be one. Actively discouraged, however.
When did you make that switch and decide to become a farmer?
Well, it's hard to actually pin that down, but I would say that I would have been 9 or 10 years old, even though we were living in a migrant city in the suburbs. I used to dream about that, prepare sort of budgets and annual programs and things like that. And then my parents moved to the Barossa when I was on the cusp of going into high school, and we lived opposite a dairy farm. And that's where I would be. They became my second family. And after school, I would always go there and there on the weekends. And ultimately, I lived with them for a while before I bought my own property, which I was 23.
Tell us a bit about, you just mentioned sort of growing up a little bit, but what sort of role did food play in your family growing up?
It's one of those, it's sort of food and hospitality, I think. My mother, it was a bit unusual at that time, we're talking about the 60s, that my mother worked full-time as well as my father, and she worked in hospitality. As a consequence of that, I got a job in hospitality when I was about 11. You can see a real German work ethic emerging, can't you? But food, I suppose, one of the things that I do remember is that you'd have the lunch break at school and everyone would sit down in a shelter shed, open up their lunch boxes, and everyone had white bread sandwiches, and I had this sort of great big enormous, what would be called a continental loaf, and with different fillings that I always almost had to sort of hide or conceal it because it felt very different. I lived in an area where there was a lot of British migrants, and there was only 2 people in the class that had a German name. All the others were Smiths and Jones and things like that. So food sort of we very much brought up with a sort of continental type background of food, but then working in hospitality early, and then my parents moved to the Barossa, and there was a restaurant motel, and one of the first and the largest in the Barossa. And I was waiting on tables and serving alcohol at 13 onwards.
Wow. Well, tell us about the early years of the farm. You mentioned you were 23 when you got your own. What did you start off farming?
Okay, so I bought a property. One of the couple of very fortunate things that happened is I went straight from school into local government, and so I'm talking 17 and a half, and urban planning, town planning was emerging as a responsibility for local government, and it's something that I just gravitated to, and I had a CEO that very much fostered that. So I got a real feel for the local landscape and farming practices, because that's what I was dealing with all the time. And ultimately, I went to university and got my qualifications, and I've always maintained my professional life alongside. And it's the only way I was able to purchase the property. So we're talking at a period when interest rates were 18%. And I actually, for 6 months, I was on bridging finance of 22. And I bought a property that was very underdeveloped. It was just 80 acres, 2 paddocks, a hill and the flats, very beautiful deep loams on the flats. But the great thing it had was a very good source of underground water. And so much so that that's been our household supply for all of the time we've been here. And so that, and my interest, having always wanted to be a farmer, having lived opposite a dairy farm and milked Jersey cows, it's a bit like a football, what football team do you follow and why did you choose that? And it's a bit like that. I fell into dairy farming, I fell into Jerseys, and it gets under your skin, and that's what I want to do, milk cows. So I built a dairy. I milked up to 40 cows twice a day, and sold the milk as a commodity to a local milk factory, and did that for about 25 years.
Well, you're known as the dairy man, and you have the heritage pork. When did you introduce pigs into the equation?
Okay, so I had two or three things were happening. One was my children, I have 3, were growing up, and I was milking cows twice a day, and I was running my planning practice, and we'd reached to about 5 people, and I was getting work interstate. And so something had to give out of those 3 things, and the obvious one, couldn't dispose of the kids. It was to give up milking cows. So I took the irrigated pasture out of production and put it in a vineyard, but I always had in mind that I'd find a way of getting back to it. So a break of about 10 years and a bit of life change for me. In that time, dairying had changed significantly, and there was less of it in the Barossa. Had moved to the Adelaide Hills and then subsequently to the southeast around Mount Gambier. And scale had changed too, that if you were milking cows, you needed to be, 200, 300, 400, which at my age was not something that I was particularly interested in. So I wanted to go back to milking cows, but I need to have an economic model to underpin it. And I recalled my early childhood memories and exposure to milk-fed pork. And I'd combine that with other very basic understandings, not highly researched, that pork had lost its flavour through industrial production, and the concern about, reduced fat and those sorts of questions. So it was a real punt that milk-fed pork might be attractive, and it was. And I started off with only about 4 cows and about 20 pigs, and and then I was milking, 10 or 12, and I've settled on about 20, but I did get to the stage where I was producing more milk than I needed, so I branched out into the into cream and butter production as well.
Wow. Tell us a little bit about the pigs. How did you decide what breeds would work best?
Well, there was someone who locally that had very much fostered the Berkshire pig, and it was Maggie Beer, and her daughter Saskia. So there was that understanding of what they had identified as being important differences between a white pig and Berkshire pigs and Tamworths as well. But their main interest was Berkshire. So it certainly came from the work that Maggie and Saskia had done.
Tell us a little bit about the region. What's so great about the Barossa for what you do with pigs?
Well, I think there's lots of attributes, but one of the significant ones is its spatial relationship to important markets, being the Adelaide Central area. We're 60 minutes drive from the CBD. So access to markets, restaurants and farmers markets is not a big task. For me, it's water availability is a critical issue in the Barossa, and some areas don't have access to it, or they have access to very salty water or good water, and we have access to good water. I'm located in a small valley. It's very beautiful, large, big, ancient red gums. And I use parts of the property that aren't productive for other things. If you're going to have a vineyard, you want a very uniform type of shape. So they don't have access, and I have two creeks going through the property. They don't have access to the creeks themselves, but it's the edges of the creeks that I use for the pigs. So it was a way of utilising what would otherwise been underutilised spaces.
What's life like on the farm for the pigs? Give us a sense of their day-to-day.
Okay, well, they're very chilled. We milk the cows in the morning, and then we feed the pigs. We have an old Massey Ferguson tractor with a 1,000-litre tank on the back that carries the milk. We've got about 6 different small paddocks that we bucket the milk into troughs. They get some crushed grain on the top of it. It looks like muesli. In this time of the year, there's not a lot of foraging, but because it's dry, I don't irrigate the pig areas. They've all got wallows. I think one of the lovely things to see is as the tractor goes, it's a bit like, a dog might be waiting for you and, in the corner of the paddock, and as the vehicle arrives, as a herd, they all go galloping along to the feeding point. And it's one of the things that that I've noticed in being involved in this is the muscle development of the animal, given that they are and they're very playful. They'll play like puppies will play. Sometimes just sort of spin around in circles, almost like chasing their tail. But then they sleep a lot too, and under the shade of the trees. And then the next, then they're fed again at night. In this case, before milking, and then we milk the cows, and that's the daily cycle. And then the weekly cycle is that we make cream on Mondays, we make butter on Tuesdays, we pack butter on Wednesdays. I take pigs to the slaughterhouse, which is about 30 minutes away, and we do the butchery there. I don't do the craftsman's ship, but the slicing and dicing and packing. I do distribution to local restaurants on the way back and off to a courier, which takes it to Adelaide restaurants. Fridays we do cream again on Friday, and then Saturday's the Barossa Farmers Market and Sunday's the Adelaide Farmers Market in the city.
Tell us a bit about the pigs, sort of their life cycle, and sort of what you're looking for by the end of that in regards to size and fat content and age.
Yeah, well, I rarely offer for sale a suckling pig. I have a personal view that it's a bit of a waste of a life, given the ratio of meat to bone to the effort it takes to get it on the ground, and we typically will run them. We aim for about 55 to 70 kilos dressed weight. At that stage, they could be 6 or 7 months old, and the size of the cuts that either a restaurant is looking for or that my customers at the farmers market would be looking for seems to work fairly well. Given it's a sort of artisan scale of production, we have usually about 80 to 90 head on the ground at any time across the different age groups, that there can be some variation in fat, and might be the season as well. But it's generally, it's one of the things that people will look for is the marbling of the fat and the layer of fat. And it's often asked, is there much difference between the Tamworth and the Berkshire? Certainly in character they are. The Tamworths are much more assertive and pushy and bossy, whereas the Berkshires are much more sort of chilled and sit around a bit. There's a couple of things that I think is worth noting, just to point on to emphasise this point. There's two things that when I started this work, and I work with a slaughterhouse butchery shop where he's been running his business for a bit longer than me, so it's nearly 50 years. I think it's about 47. And my pig would be hanging on the rails, and there'd be one next to it. And he'd say, look at this. And he'd tap it, mine, and it was like a rock. And then the one next to it, you could almost lose your finger, almost like pushing your finger into the palm of your hand. There was no... And I'm sure that's got something to do with the milk feeding, but also the muscle development. And at one stage, that's one observation. And then the other was that earlier on, I was running a bit low in numbers, and there was a breeder that had a sort of sideline of Berkshires, and I bought some, I think 3, to help me out with the numbers at probably about 12 weeks. And what really struck me is that I went to go and pick them up, and they were just beautiful. They looked like a China pig. They had this black silky hair, and what was the reason? They'd never been out of a shed. They'd never been in mud or anything like that. And they actually made my pigs look pretty ordinary because they looked so beautiful. But then when they got here, there was a bit of a concrete slab around the edge of the water trough, and that's all. They just wanted to sit on that concrete slab.
Pigs are known to be real characters, and a lot of the farmers that we've had on the show have had all sorts of stories. Do you have any sort of funny stories of what it's like dealing with pigs and living with them?
Well, is it two? One was just yesterday, and I have to say that once I heard from you, I thought I better. I've had the headphones on for the last couple of days listening to all the episodes. So yesterday I was working out with doing some yard work, and there was some rails which are pinned together, and a pig just came up along, and the pin has a bend at the top, and it decided it wanted to pull out this pin. So first of all, it used its snout and lift it and drop, lift it, drop, lift it, drop. There's in, and then it decided to use his teeth. So he grabbed it. He was there for about 5 minutes, determined to get this pin out. But he did. And he would have, had I been relying upon it, it would have been an escape route. But he was just playing with it and very entertained by it. But the other thing that really struck me earlier on was, because I've dealt with dairy cows, all the kids were equestrians, and I used to event as well. So we've dealt with horses and pigs. They're all herd animals. And they want to stick together and be together. And when you're working them, you have to understand that to organise how to move them. But pigs are different. They're such social creatures, and they cuddle up to each other and often say they're like a pack of sausages. The way they top and tail, I mean, and snuggle up. And I'm thinking, well, why are they so social like that? And of course, it didn't take me that long to think about it, but of course they're born in litters, and that's their first moments in life. That's what they do. And I just took a photograph of a new litter the other day. They were they weren't lined up, they were all in a circle on top of each other. And of course, with a cow, it's usually a single birth. With a horse, it's a single birth, but it's the fact that they come in a litter. But their social nature and their desire to snuggle up to each other is interesting. I remember once, they all have huts, and I used to have to start very early in the morning to sort of milk feed the pigs and then get off to the market. And sometimes I'd get up and feed them, and it was pitch black, and they'd all be asleep in the house, and they're all again cuddled up, and it's super warm because the body heat. Even in cold conditions, you don't need air conditioning under those circumstances. But the snoring, it was like a series from the Three Stooges, when they always used to lie in bed together and all sort of snore and then turn over and they snore again. And anyway, they're a couple of little stories.
Well, that's amazing. Well, what sort of culinary impact and eating experience does the milk feeding have on the pork that you produce?
I think it's maybe best to speak to some of the chefs to answer this in a more serious way. But you interviewed Jake Kelly the other day, and he touched on this question. And so it's the depth of flavour. I think it's the softness of the fat, the fact that it renders very easily, sort of melts and infuses into the meat. Beyond that, I'm not able to say.
Well, on those experiences that you've had of eating your own pork, do you have one or two that you can tell us about the way it was cooked and what you?
Well, it's the same one that everyone else has been answering. It's the neck. I think I like doing the neck because it's simple, and I typically will roast it either without any fuss, bit of olive oil, salt, and maybe some rosemary. Brown it off each side for a few minutes, put in the oven, leave it. This is the sort of thing I can be cooking while I'm milking the cows, and you come back and it's done. Just let it rest, serve it in slice it thinly and its own juices. But then I've got another recipe, if I can organise myself, which has got some coriander, ginger and garlic in a marinade for about an hour, and then a sauce over it, which is a bit similar in its composition. And they're always winners. People just always remark upon it.
What is it about farming and being on the farm that you love so much?
There's not one thing, but I think these days, look, I think it would be a really tough gig being a farmer generally, working alone, the grind of, especially a dairy farmer, of getting up early, milking 200 cows. There's going to be a sick one. There's going to be this. There's always something that is going wrong, and then to do it all again and up until it's got better just recently, but sending away your product and getting paid for almost less than the cost of production, and going backwards financially. That's a really tough gig. And then doing, you can really appreciate how the mental health questions get to you. I mean, for me, I'm dealing. I'll just go back one step, but I always, particularly my urban planning role, and one of the things I'm interested in is the future of peri-urban areas for agricultural production and protecting them for that. And I am a strong advocate that we think about farming in ways in which has happened for 100 years or so, or longer, and we're not open to alternatives of the type that I've described and that I do. And I try to explain this simply by saying, ask the question, do farmers produce food? And if I ask that question, people will always jump in and say yes. And my answer to that is, well, they actually don't. They produce commodities. Other people turn them to food. If it's flour, if it's wheat, it has to be turned to flour by someone else, or if it's milk, it's got to be pasteurised and bottled and distributed. Well, nothing leaves this place as a commodity. Everything is converted to food. And so we, as a consequence, and that involves producing it, processing it, packaging it, marketing it, wholesaling it, retailing it, and distributing it. We don't have a distributor. I do everything. And as a consequence, you're dealing with the end user of, be it a chef or a customer at the farmer's market. And I think that level of feedback and satisfaction and appreciation for the effort that you've gone to, and the fact that the level of compliments that you get about, this is the best bacon I've tried in my life, sausages are amazing, there's no other one, it's not measurable, but that's their experience. And the fact that they're willing to tell you that, and the fact that they come back week after week and have followers and people present themselves, and I know exactly what they're looking for, as they're approaching the stall. So, I'm in a very lucky position to have that form of farming, and I'm a very strong advocate for trying to encourage other people to open their minds to it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of I don't think people have the confidence necessarily of knowing. I mean, it's a very wide skill set that's required to go from commodity to food. And if I can help with that, I try to.
Well, Michael, it's absolutely extraordinary what you're doing there, and I know you've got many more stories, but it's been an absolute honour to have you on the Crackling today. Please keep in touch, and we'd love to catch up again soon.
Thank you very much. There's other stories to tell.
This is The Crackling, a Deep in the Weeds production in partnership with PorkStar. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we catch up with some of Australia's best chefs and pork producers to discover what makes Australian pork so special.